Thank you. We've got the Plan Change 1 Woolston Risk Management Area. And Mark, you're still sitting at the end of the table.
That's right.
Yeah. Would you like to do a bit of an intro on this one as well? Because, I mean, obviously we've got some new councillors around the table. The ones who were here before have got a good understanding of where we got to, but others will need a bit of an update as well. Thank you.
So as background, the district plan was made operative in 2017 following a comprehensive review. Thereafter, there was effectively an embargo on council or anyone requesting a plan change to amend the district plan, and that embargo was lifted in March of this year. Council staff have identified a program of plan changes to amend the district plan, and we'll be presenting that to the appropriate committee in due course. This report relates to the first of a number of plan changes, Plan Change 1, and that was notified
20th
March of this year, and has been through a process of submissions, hearing, and we've now had a recommendation. Just stepping back from that for a moment, the plan change is being prepared under the Resource Management Act. So, as some councillors will be aware, we have different channels by which to amend the district plan. We can use what's a common process amongst councils, which is under the Resource Management Act. The other process available to council at the present time is use of the Greater Christchurch Regeneration Act. This plan change followed the traditional process of under the RMA. The plan change is concerned with minimising risk to health and safety of people around two fuel terminals in Woolston. So there's two large fuel terminals, one operated by a number of oil companies, the other by liquid gas, and the plan change has come about by necessity. As part of the district plan review, the independent hearings panel that was responsible for making decisions on the district plan, they approved hazardous substances and contaminated land chapter, and that included rules about managing the risk around these fuel terminals, but they weren't satisfied that there was enough evidence presented by the oil companies and liquid gas about the risk to people and life. And so they put a sunset clause in. What that means is they put an expiry date on these rules. So after a certain date, those rules would no longer have effect. And so the risk of those rules expiring would be that activities like preschools and housing could have occurred in proximity of these fuel terminals, which, if there was an explosion or other significant event, that could present a risk to those people. So the necessity was identified to proceed with this plan change before the expiry of those rules, and to enable the continuation of those rules to apply. Now, the rules that have been proposed for this plan change are to do a number of things. I gave the example of limiting housing and preschools in proximity of those facilities. It's it's a finer grain in terms of what the specifics are, but it's essentially limiting or seeking to avoid sensitive activities in proximity to the fuel terminals, and that includes housing, preschools, guest accommodation, schools, and that's by making them a non-complying activity. The plan change also seeks to revise the extent of the area, defined it as having a risk, and so that's expanded slightly, but also amalgamated two separate risk management areas. One important point is that the plan change is, the rules have been written such that anyone proposing an activity in proximity of the risk, in proximity of the facilities, would not have to prepare a risk assessment for each proposal. So if I was proposing a preschool in proximity of the fuel terminal. As a consequence of these rules, I wouldn't, if I was proposing an industrial activity, as a better example, I wouldn't need to prepare a risk assessment because that's now been carried out by the oil companies. In terms of the process that we've gone through, it was notified, as I mentioned, in March 2019. There were 5 submissions made, and some of the key players to that were the fuel companies themselves, the liquid gas, as well as Littleton Port Company and some more localised business operators. As a consequence of discussions with those submitters, we reached, they agreed to the proposed rules and policy, and on that basis the hearing was deemed not necessary, and the Commissioner has proceeded to making a recommendation to Council on the submissions and on what Council has proposed without the need for a hearing. So what is put to you as an attachment to this report is the Commissioner's recommendations and a recommendation that Council adopts that recommendation. If Council were not to adopt that recommendation, the options are that it could be referred back to the Commissioner or referred to another Commissioner to consider. If it were referred to another Commissioner to consider, they would need to hear and consider all the submissions received and the information that's already been assessed. The alternative is that this Council hears the same information and makes a decision itself, but could not do so without receiving and hearing that information. As a Council plan change, the other option is that the plan change is withdrawn, but given the process, we'd recommend that the plan change recommendation is adopted.
Is there a time requirement on this? I mean, does this have to be decided today, or could we have a briefing for councillors in between times and determine it at the next meeting?
There's a statutory requirement that a decision is made within 2 years of notification. So there is time. For the interests of the parties concerned, we brought it to this council meeting for to enable the if the council adopted the recommendation, it would then be subject to a 30-day appeal period, and thereafter would come back to council to have it formally made operative. So this is the first of 2 meetings that we'll come back to council for.
So I just wanted to check that because, you know, sometimes there are those, I mean, I'm very comfortable with this myself, but I'm only one voice, so I'd like to just sort of test the feeling around the table. If people are generally comfortable to continue on that basis, then I'll continue. If not, I'll let it lie on the table until the next meeting. People general
just, you know, it's not just about childcare facilities, is it? It's about any activity.
Yanni, are we going to a decision today, or are we going to defer it?
Well, I personally would like a briefing on it with the map to show just what changes have been made and what the difference is, because it's not really clear from here what the changes are when it first came to us around the area, and there was a huge issue with the port, it would appear, and I'm just not quite sure what the implications are of that. So personally, I would prefer a briefing, but others may have a different view.
Okay, well, I mean, I just think that, I mean, I know you've all got your inaugural community board meetings next week, but there will be time that those councillors that want to be briefed on it could come in for a briefing. But if it's just one person, then we'll proceed today,
I'm happy to move.
and Yanni can get a briefing afterwards.
I'm happy to move.
Okay, so it's been moved and seconded. All right, so we'll open it up.
Well, can you just explain why the port was so concerned and why they've changed their view?
Littleton Port Company made a submission. They were they expressed concern about the effects that the rules would have on their operations. They have an inland port on Chapman's Road, which is within within the risk management area. Their concern was the additional costs that the plan change would put on them. That also arose from that they opposed relief that was sought by the oil companies. The oil companies had sought that every business or landowner within the area had to prepare an emergency response plan in the event of evacuation, and Littleton Port Company was concerned about the costs of that on their business and what they could do, and the oil companies subsequently withdrew what they were seeking, and Littleton Port Company was satisfied in that regard. The other points that Littleton Port Company were concerned about was
check, is there any requirement for people to have those site emergency plans now, or is that just no longer?
So the argument that was put by the oil companies was that the emergency management plans required by businesses and property owners should be required in order for the interest of the health and safety of those people. The view that council staff put to the oil companies was that that's duplicating other legislation. So there's health and safety legislation that has similar requirements for emergency management plans, and it should be through that legislation that any requirement is met, rather than using a district plan under an RMA process.
Right. The other question was, has the extent of the area changed?
The area has altered, and that's based on scientific evidence of the risk profile. So if you think of in the same way that there's contour lines around the airport associated with noise, there's different levels of risk which are represented by contours around the fuel terminals, and so the updated investigation of risk found that the risk profile should be the mapped area should be amended to reflect that change in risk profile, and that's based on evidence from qualified experts.
Was that evidence from the fuel companies though?
That was provided by the fuel companies, but council had it peer reviewed by an independent consultant.
Right, and it's shrunk or it's increased or changed?
With the oil companies, it's shrunk, and then the liquid gas, it increased. But I remember we did put it to council 2 or 3 times before we came to council to report on this, even with the community board, and showed the difference in the planning maps with the existing and the proposed or the amended overlays, and that the changes to the overlay was not because of the actual risk to the people, the changes to the risk, but because of the modeling. It's more to do with the technical
right,
modeling.
No, I understand that, but just in terms of after it's come to us and we've seen it,
Yes.
my understanding through the submission process and the decision-making process of the commissioner, the maps have changed.
No.
No, they haven't. Okay, that's
They
what I was trying to understand. Thank you.
It's been the same.
And just the final question is there any impact on the traffic or cycling or pedestrians? Like, was there any assessment around the risk around people that are using it as a through route, a recreation route, or in terms of any sort of mitigation when you do have something that, if it goes wrong, was there any consideration of access?
So the risk to those that are transient, so travelling through the area, I understand the risk is considered to be minimal to the point that it's negligible for those users, such that the rules that relate to activities within the area, they don't relate to people moving through the area, which the district plan is would be limited in terms of what it could do in that respect.
Right, I'm just, in my mind, I remember what we did in Littleton where we shut access off through the area close to the fuel tanks, and I'm just trying to understand from a conceptual point of view, given that we've got roading changes proposed for here and we've got a cycleway, whether there's anything that's come out of the hearing or the evidence that we need to be aware of.
There would be, there's nothing to indicate changes such as that are required. In terms of, in the event of a significant event, an emergency response would include evacuation and potentially changes to the movement of people and vehicles to avoid them being exposed to any risk at the time of an incident. But for the sake of permanent infrastructure, such as the cycleway, it wouldn't. There's nothing to indicate that changes would be required in that.
Very good. Sarah?
That. The cycleway in question is currently not constructed. Is there anything that would get in the way of not making changes to something that's currently there, but get in the way of the construction of the cycleway in that area?
I'm not aware of anything that would preclude that.
Right. Phil?
So, likes of say liquid gas at Chapman's Road, where we are building a building. Is it conflict of interest? If we're building a building within about 40 metres of it, a commercial building has no problems. Only schools, preschools, houses, stuff like that. We're in Chapman's Road. So
the implications of the rules and the policy are for sensitive activities, like I described. The zoning of this area is industrial, and it's expected that activities that are permitted or enabled by the plan by other status is continues, that they're unimpeded. There are activities in the industrial zone that are defined as non-complying or discretionary for other reasons, and they would be subject to an assessment in terms of exposure. But other, just reiterating, activities that are anticipated in the industrial zone would not be constrained.
All right, I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried. Thank you very much.